Welcome to Just One Thing for Parents. I'm Bettina Honan. In today's episode, we delve deeper into the topic of technology and young people. And we really focus on how age plays a role in how we can manage social media and phone use in young people. Joining us is Beth Kerr, who is a consultant in wellbeing, learning, and digital habits. So we discuss the neuroscience of the teenage brain and how that can guide adults to protecting teens. We also discussed Jonathan Haidt's new book, The Age of Anxiety, where he pushes to ban mobile phones for those under the age of 16. Beth gives a really good critique of the research in that book, pointing out that while that solution may be tempting, it's perhaps too simplistic and quite impractical. So we end with thinking about what parents really can do, thinking about establishing clear boundaries right from the beginning, remembering you're the adult, you can really trust yourself, and keeping the communication with teens open, as I always discuss. So please keep listening for my interview with Beth Kerr. So welcome, Beth. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Lovely to be here.
So this is the third in a little mini series thinking about technology, AI, the internet, social media. So we're really going a little bit deeper in thinking about social media and young people. And the question for you is, what is just one thing that parents can do to empower their child to optimize the benefits of social technology and to minimize its risks?
Okay. If it was just one thing, I think I would start by saying to think about teenagers and children through a developmental lens. And what I mean by that is that brain development has a profound impact on thoughts, feelings, and behavior towards themselves, towards you, as their parents, the family, and towards their friends. And if we know and understand a little bit more about these sort of key developments, it'll help us understand them and their innate drives better, and hopefully decrease the friction that so often surrounds family discussions around tech. And I think all too often, I've seen so many of these debates around the impact of smartphones and social media on children and young people just lumped together. And I think by doing this, it doesn't really serve anyone. We underprotect our younger primary school children, and then we risk alienating or teaching rather our teenagers how to sort of safely navigate online spaces, and then we end up causing this big rift between them and the adults in their life, the people who care about them the most. And I don't know whether it's helpful for me to kind of bring it to life a little bit with an example from childhood. And I think when we first have our children, we've read all those books and we're kind of on it. We're really attuned to their brain development, every stage, and we know which stage of behavior results in what type of behavior. So, then we think
about
where
it a lot, don't we? When kids are very little, we get the books, and month by month, what are they supposed to be doing now? We really think about their development and their age. Yeah,
with absolutely. The first child, by the third child, it goes out the window. But with the first child, you're sort of quite on it, and you then sort of take steps to either mitigate or encourage whatever the behaviour is. So when they're rolling, when they go from that stage where you can plonk them anywhere and they're nice and still, and then they start rolling. And as soon as they get to that stage, not to leave them on a bed or I mean, no judgment to anyone who has. I have done that at the wrong time, but they're going to roll. And then when they get to that stage where they're walking, you try to encourage that. You get the baby walker or all sorts of things. And then when they're toddlers and they're in that, they're into everything stage, I'm sure there's a better term for that. But because not to let them in sight of the cookie jar or the I don't know, the oven or whatever, because their cognitive function is not developed enough to resist the physical motivation to go and grab things and move things. But even though we sort of really respect those developments when they're little, I feel like when they're a teenager, and I worked for a long time in secondary education, and I felt like adults, parents, teachers also are guilty of kind of downplaying that. You'd sort of say, "Oh, stop trying to impress your friends," really almost mocking it sometimes. And you'd see situations where, I don't know, let's say you'd have a year 11 boy, 15-year-old boy, and they're in a class and they're being silly and they throw a rubber and the rubber nearly hits you. And you're in this fork in the road and it can go one of two ways. You could take them outside where they're away from their friends and you can say, what is going on there? And they would 99% of the time say, oh yes, sorry miss, sorry, fine. No, that often that didn't happen. And then you shout them in front of their friends. And even though they know they've done wrong, the social stigma and the social consequence of apologizing to a teacher in front of all their friends and losing face is too big. So they then tell you where to go, and then the whole thing, gets sort of catastrophized. So
that's because of their teenage brain, and because social integration and peer acceptance and validation is so important at that age, isn't it?
So important. And with tech, you imagine all the sort of, you confiscate their phone, but actually you're thinking you're addicted to your phone while you're always on your phone, but actually what you're also taking away is their access to their friends. And that is the most important people rather in their life, as you've just said. And so it never ends up, going particularly well.
So what you're saying is, when in the early years, we're really in tune, sometimes month by month, to thinking about what's the child doing developmentally, how do I need to protect them, where do I need to push them? But somehow when it comes to these teenagers, we lump them all together, and we don't think maybe there's a difference between, well, there's two things. We don't think there's a difference between a 12 and 13-year-old versus a 16, 17-year-old.
Yeah.
And we also don't bear in mind that there's stuff going on in their brain, which means that they're in tune to certain aspects of the environment. And therefore we have to think about how we respond. It's both of those things, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, and you would explain this far better than I would, but I would think there are sort of three key things that we need to have in our mind. So one, that thing you talked about in terms of their the peer influence, it being not just something desirable, it's an innate biological drive to gain independence, and served us very well for generations. This idea of increased risk and impulsivity in front of friends, I think I'm right in saying the evidence is strong in front of friends, so that they are more likely to do that. And then the malleability to learn new things, new behaviors, new habits, new empathy, all of those sorts of things. And if you could look at those things to try and understand your child's behavior on tech, like why on earth would they post that selfie of, why would they do that? They know it's silly. Yeah, they did, but it was impulsive, and there were lots of friends there. And that helps them explain it, rather than sort of saying, why did you do that? Which is possibly the most pointless question to ever ask.
I know, which we do.
Anyone.
But, and that's right. And that is because in the context of friends, what's happening, just to kind of tune into the science a little bit more, is the reward centers of the brain become highly, highly activated. So these control centers of the brain are less able to do their work in those moments. So when teenagers are with their friends, and particularly it's in the younger teenage years, isn't it? And it tends to reduce with age. But particularly when they're with their peers, they're more likely to make these reward-based, maybe more risky choices, which is on the phone a lot of the time.
Of course it is. Yeah. And we're not very sympathetic. You think when a child starts to walk, they don't sort of get up and then walk instantly. They can do it once, and then they do it again. And it's a similar thing with teenagers. It's not that they don't know it was silly to post that comment, but to just never post that comment is a skill that takes time to learn. So when you say, well, they knew it was silly, well, yeah, but the baby knew how to walk. They know how, they've done it now. Why can't they do it all the time? Well, it just takes skill. And I just think sometimes we're not as patient with our teenagers as we are, when they're cute little bundles.
Yeah. So can I ask you, so there was a book that was released recently. So we're recording this podcast in the beginning of June 2024, and I think a couple of months ago, a book by Jonathan Haidt was published called The Anxious Generation, and it's really caused quite a debate. I wonder if you could just outline his key arguments and then give us a little bit of view on what he said.
It was actually even in Grazia magazine this week.
Oh, was it?
Wow.
You read Grazia magazine, Ben?
Yeah, I do. So I think, look, on one hand, I think he shines a really important and bright light on a key issue. And sometimes you need these sort of polarizing standpoints to shift things forward. And he really, puts the blame, if you like, for the mental health crisis firmly at the feet of the mobile phone or a phone-based childhood, as he calls it. And
so is that the link to the title? So he's saying the anxious generation is due to social media.
He thinks there's been a rewiring of children's brains due to a number of a reduction in play-based childhood. So more and more controls put on primary school children to actually go and play, and they're stuck inside, but without regulation online. And then that social media and that smartphones and that sort of constant bombardment is the sole sort of, or the primary, I shouldn't say the sole cause of the decline in mental health. And he uses really strong language, panic-inducing sort of statements, and then he comes up with some solutions. So I think there are a couple of issues with this. I think number one, the evidence that he cites is not always reliable, and I feel he almost treats parents like idiots. Like we can cope with a little bit of news. You can explain that a study is not perfect, but it may show this. But instead, he cherry picks data and omits other potential information. So, for example, I think there was one, and don't quote me, there was one graph that showed a huge increase in girls' mental health at a certain point in time that he said could only really be attributed to the increase in smartphone ownership, social media ownership. He didn't mention that at that exact time, there was also a change in the way that they collected and interpreted the data, which is bound to have an impact as well. It doesn't negate the fact there is an impact. And I think he doesn't sort of include in the studies he cites, some of them don't even include teenagers, yet he generalizes across. So I think I would have found it more credible if the evidence was more presented in a more balanced way, because I think now he's almost doing exactly what he's sort of saying the big tech companies are doing, and not allowing parents to make proper decisions. He doesn't kind of differentiate between teens. You just mentioned a sort of 13-year-old and a 17-year-old. I mean, it's just two huge gaps between these, and tech, social media. The children I've spoken to, they're like, does Uber Eats count? I mean, probably not, but it's just lumped together, and so that these are amorphous groups of categories, if you like. So no nuance, no individual context, and then the solutions he comes up with, I think they're based on gut feeling, not research. There's also a lack of understanding in the kind of complexities and trade-offs inherent in the approaches that he supports. His simple solutions really conceal any practical, logistical, legal, societal, cultural challenges. It just makes me think of trying to herd cats in quicksand. There was one, I suppose I'm trying to think of what has it been like just in the UK trying to get legislation changed, and how quickly it happens or doesn't happen. So when he says 4 simple solutions, and then
just say what the 4 simple solutions are. Can you just
the one is to the one I sort of think, that would be great. About encouraging more free play for the children. I think most people would.
That's a great recommendation. Yeah.
But there are areas of the country and in the world where that's not safe, so it has to be presented with, it's all very well if you live in a leafy garden suburb. If you live in somewhere where knife crime is rife, you probably don't want your kids roaming around. So there's a bit of difference there. But I think generally that's a sensible principle. He talks about no social media until 16, no smartphones until...
So banning until 16.
Yeah.
This is like the big thing, isn't it?
Yes. And smartphones, and no smartphones at all until, I mean, it's in America, so the ages are slightly different. So I think middle school is 14, maybe that would be, which also, those are sensible ideas. And for schools, the final one is for schools to ban phones completely. A lot of schools I know do this already.
I think that's happening more and more. It seems sensible because it really impacts on your ability to focus and learn.
Yeah, I think there are, and some schools who don't do it use tech really well, and they've got measures to, I think head teachers and school leaders should be, able to make those decisions for their schools. But those are sensible. But when he says, oh, let's just, ban smartphones, or, he's talking about legislation. Well, if you look at the online safety bill that's just recently came in, it actually first came up in 2018. Then I think it was 2021, it was published. Then in 2023, it received some royal assent, and it said it'd be implemented in 3 phases. And then 2025, that's at the end of 2025, that's when it will be anticipated that it will happen. Okay, so that's, I don't know, 7 years from discussing it to implementing it.
And what
So
is it easy to say what that legislation is?
the online safety bill is a big document that puts additional restrictions on tech companies and responsibility and accountability.
So it's really putting the onus on the tech companies.
Yeah,
it's putting
it
some
is.
real clear rules about what the tech company, which is different from what Jonathan Haidt is saying.
Well, it is yes and no, because if you're saying no social media for under 16s, okay, so what social media are you talking about? When are you going to start this?
And whose responsibility?
How are you going to enforce it? He's going to, I presume, the responsibility will be on the tech companies who will fight back, and it'll take, so I think.
See what you're saying. It's going to take a long time.
A long time, and an inordinate amount of time to pass this sort of legislation. So I'm not sure. I worry a lot then about the kids who are 13 and 14 and 15 now. Yeah. What about them? They're sort of half in and half out. Yeah. So I worry a little bit about those. And then practically, I look at the one, the government have been discussing this thing about no social media until they're 16. So I was thinking, all right, how's this going to work then? So in year 11, they're doing their GCSEs. So the kids who are born in September, they get them first, right? Wicked. So they're like, woo, you're oldest in the year group. So then everybody else either doesn't have them and is, feels excluded from that friendship group or not, or more likely to happen, they'll find some way of circumnavigating. So rather than studying for their exams, they'll be kind of trying to hack into, or just at a time where the child really needs parents, and harmonious relationships, and stress is at quite a high point. They're trying to enforce the fact that you can't, because their birthday is not till June. So they're trying to enforce that. And, I just think, I can imagine that being.
There are problems. There are real problems.
Going to be problems with it. So I totally support the movement for more regulation in online spaces, 100%. I think there's something like there is more regulation about the sale of eggs than there is about this. I mean, it's a joke. However,
there's more what?
There's more regulation about the sale of eggs than there is about online.
Is there really? Wow.
So, of course, it's unacceptable, and it 100% is in the dire need of change. Yes. But I think if you've got kids in this age group now, I think, the parents will have a hugely important influence on the way that tech either supports or subverts their child's progress and well-being. And for Jonathan Haidt or anyone else to say otherwise, I think is misleading.
Yeah. And I think the trouble with a book like that, where, he argues brilliantly, and he's brought up in a very important debate. But I think sometimes what those things can do is they come into somebody's life, and they really have an impact on the relationship between the parent and the teenager, because a parent feels like, oh, okay, so I'm going to stick up for this, and I'm going to do this, I'm going to ban it, and you can't have a phone. And, it kind of comes out of nowhere in the culture and context that we're in, which is far from ideal. But, as you always know, I always say relationships need to come first, and we have to think carefully about how these pieces of information land in families and how parents are supposed to manage it.
Yeah, exactly. And you miss the opportunity. You don't give your child a phone until they're 16. They could leave home then. So then they've never had access to social media at all. And then all of a sudden they have it completely, and they've left home, and you've got no chance to and anyone who's got
guide and protect them. No,
you'd have gone through this, ups and downs, and, and there's, I just feel Pandora's out of a box a little bit. We can't just simplify it and say, oh, well, let's just put it all back in, because there's a whole generation of kids that are in it now. And so I think parents are probably, as much as I would love to believe that tech companies could kind of behave more responsibly, we'll always be pushing against them. So,
So, Beth, can you give us some top advice for a parent who's sitting there now, maybe a parent who is struggling with their teenager? They're not sure when to give them a phone. They're not sure how to give them a phone. They want to take into account this developmental model. Maybe they really believe that I don't think my kids should be having social media at all. But it's not quite the context to just completely ban it for your 16-year-old. I think that would be a hard thing to do in today's age. Do you have some advice that you would give to parents?
Yeah, so back to developmental, but I find it helpful. The more I read about the developmental lens, it sort of strengthens my resolve in doing what I feel is right. I think just to be primary school children, okay, you're just about still cool and worth impressing. Take the most of that
As a
opportunity.
parent, you're still
As
cool.
a parent, I find it difficult to sort of understand why on earth you would want to give them social media and in primary school age. It's a build, relationship skills, all those sorts of things. Because as soon as they get into the teenagers and friends are important, then it's a whole different ball game. But you are the adult, and it's really hard because we doubt ourselves as parents all the time. But we do pay the bills, and actually, you do know more about health and well-being than your young teenager thinks. And those things are super. Sleep, diet, exercise, relationships, giving, doing something fulfilling. They're super important. So sort of trust yourself with that. But digital boundaries are essential to help them develop digital habits. So if you imagine your role, rather than take it away, don't take it away, you're trying to help your child develop healthy habits in the same way you help them develop healthy habits around sleep and exercise. You don't leave the house now and they eat all the chocolate and sweets and everything. You don't, because you've taught them that they're nice sometimes, not all the time. And you can do the same thing. But I think do not expect them to be able to do it on their own, because if you look at that lens, if you give them the phone overnight in bed and you say, I trust my child, it's nothing to do with trust. That sort of makes out that the child is not, is weak. It's nothing to do with that. These are hugely powerful games that are designed, or platforms that are designed on brain development. Just take it, just take the sort of, the temptation away.
Be very clear, that's a rule, and set it up from the beginning. And
you do them a favor. You actually do them a favor, and stick to it consistent. It never changes. It never changes. Just in the same way, if they say, "Oh, can I have some vodka?" No, you just know you can't. You're not 18 yet. And then finally, you talk about this all the time about communication being, and I think building a dialogue as they get older. But rather than it being yes, no, there's some interesting questions that I picked up from, I think it's this person called L.M. Sarakas, I think, and things like, what will this tech encourage me to notice or ignore? How will this tech affect how I relate to other people? Does this technology?
You want teens to be asking themselves these questions, or you
ask
have
you,
these conversations.
You have a chat with them. Can I imagine living without this technology? And you can have a laugh about that. Does it, allow me to allocate my time wisely? So I think those 4 things about developmental lens. You are the adult. Trust yourself. Keep reading up on this stuff. It's difficult, but get those digital boundaries, and you'll have to tweak them as they get older in line with that sort of developmental lens. But if you can keep the communication thing going, I think that's probably your best bet.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have such an opportunity. And I think both Mark and Daniel, who are the other podcasts in this little mini series, also, like, the main message is you have to keep talking to kids about it and set them up, with this digital media. We can't get rid of it. We can't ban it. It is there, but we can help children to manage it. And those frameworks that you've given us today are so helpful, thinking about, particularly about development. I think is just so important. We forget that not all teenagers are the same.
They're not. And we feel we don't have, I think of it a bit like a day at the beach, the sea. If you're trying to kind of find that quick fix, it's, the number of hours or which apps that can they always use. It's like trying to, brush the tide away with the broom. You don't go to the beach and just hope your kids are going to be safe. You know, the sea can be dangerous. They'll get carried away. They hate putting sun cream on. So you just put rules in place. Some are strict, like, you have to put sun cream on, and some are a bit more relaxed. Pick whatever ice cream you want, be back in 5 minutes, whatever it is. But you don't underestimate the power of the sea. You don't underestimate, that you don't think, oh, it cares for my child. It's not going to,
right.
keep them away. But you still see that there's some benefit from it. And I suppose I see digital tech a bit like that. And I can still be ambitious that tech companies will become more ethical. But perhaps I'm just cynical, and I think, in the meantime, what can I do as a parent to help my kids, get through this phase?
Such a brilliant place to end. Thank you so much, Beth, for coming on today.
No, it was great. It was great to speak to you. And good luck. It's hard. That's the other thing. I know it's hard. It is hard,
I
for sure.
really agree.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
No. Thank you so much.
Take care. No worries. Bye.